Hi, welcome to the Prairie Oaks Pulpit Bible Study. And we are in the book of Mark chapter 12. And we are covering 3 ancient landmarks. We've been going through our series of ancient landmarks, including where the Lord describes himself. And we saw the Lord our God, gracious, compassionate, remember, slow to anger, abundant in covenant love and faithfulness, that he is the I am that I am. We saw the 10 Commandments and how that plays into it. And so those were some of our big ones from the law. Then we saw in the Psalm 23. And then now we're looking in the teachings of Jesus. But Jesus actually uses one ancient landmark and gives us 2 more of his own. So we're going to launch from Mark chapter 12. It's also recorded in Matthew chapter 22, but I like Mark's telling of it better. So Matthew 22 is a little shorter. Mark chapter 12, I'm going to begin in verse 28. Then one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, perceiving that he had answered them well, asked him, "Which is the first commandment of all?" Jesus answered him, "The first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second, like it, is this: You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." So the scribe said to him, "Well said, teacher. You have spoken the truth, for there is one God, and there is no other but he. And to love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." Now when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." But after that, no one dared question him. So to put this in context, this is towards the end of Jesus' earthly ministry, and it's a very confrontational section. It's his last week on earth before his crucifixion. And there's a confrontation with all of the religious leaders. There is a confrontation with the people who follow Herod and the Herodians, basically those who cooperate with the Romans and the Pharisees. Then he takes on the priestly class known as Sadducees and answers their question. And all of these are not friendly questions. This is rhetorical combat is what it is. And now that he's put them to silence, this is the context of this scribe, who's probably a Pharisee as well. He asked a question, and it may have been confrontational, but I have a suspicion he already knew what Jesus was going to say. And he may have been asking for other reasons, not the least of which, some peace of mind. He may not have got it, though. So now let's dive into this here. So he comes to Jesus and he says, "What is the first commandment of all?" Now he's not talking about first in time, but first in priority. What is the foremost? What is the most important of all the commandments? And the rabbis had decided there were about 613 commandments in the Old Testament law. And they couldn't decide which ones were the most important ones and which ones were not as important. And so this was something they were debating, and they got Jesus in on it. What do you say is the most important one? And out of all the answers, this one is kind of unique. From what we can see of what the rabbis were discussing, this wasn't one of the common answers. But it become common, apparently, because Jesus had apparently taught this several times, and that's why we see In Luke's gospel, when he records it, it's in a whole different situation, and the questioner actually gives Jesus this answer, and I suspect it's because he knew that was Jesus's answer to the question. And maybe like this guy, he was wanting a little affirmation that he was doing okay. And so, what is Jesus's answer? He doesn't make it up. He doesn't come up with, one of the 10 even. But this is what he says is the most important, the first, foremost of all the commandments. And he pulls straight out of not just the law, but out of all of Israelite culture, an ancient landmark. It is from Deuteronomy, and we're going to look at it in a little bit here in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So you might stick your thumb there here in a little bit. But this is how Jesus reads it to him. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. He pulls it straight from the Greek translation of the Old Testament law, and he says, we've been repeating this all of our lives, morning and evening, every day. And this is the most important commandment. Is it not to love our God with all of our being? Because he is first and he is foremost. So it sounds a lot like the first of the 10 commands, right? At least the way that I teach it in the shorthand method. One God, God first, right? That's where this kind of comes from. That he's one, that he is unified. There's not different versions of Yahweh, but only one. And that he comes first. You shall have no other gods before him. He is alone in that regard. And that it's to love him. It's loyalty. It's faithfulness. Those are hard virtues to cultivate in our lives. But it's to love him with all of our being for all time. Because he is faithful. He is steadfast. He is ever true in his covenant love. And Jesus, who is often the one to give us more than what we ask for, says what? And the second is like it. And so in essence, he says, this one is of equal importance. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's no other commandment greater than these. Now, for this one here, he's pulling from another part of the law. This is Leviticus 19. And I'd really encourage you to read through Leviticus 19. Because there's sections in there that we'd be like, surely he doesn't mean that today, does he? And then we come across not one, but two different places. He tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Verse 18 and verse 34, Leviticus 19. And it doesn't just mean our kinfolk, but to love even the stranger, the foreigner who comes to dwell among us. Love him as you love yourself. And so you see now where that's that ancient landmark. And I told you we're going to go back to Deuteronomy here in a minute here. And so the Deuteronomy one is important here. Deuteronomy 6, it's important to look at it in its context. So in Deuteronomy 6, I'm going to start in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. There it is. That's the Shema that Israelites have recited from the days of Moses to this day. This is still their confession of faith. It is the bedrock upon which a practicing Jew, a religious Jew that's what they bank on here. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these aren't meant to delineate different parts of the being, but just to be a way of summing up all of it. And that's why when Jesus quoted it, he added a fourth part, because he's quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And when they translated it, they added a fourth term just to make sure they were covering all of one's being, the heart with the seat of emotions, the mind, the thoughts, the soul, with all of one's invisible being, but also with all of one's strength, with their actions they take and the words that they say, all to be for the Lord and love for him. And it's not to be a dead end only with us, but in Deuteronomy 6, he says, "And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." And a little later, he says in that same chapter, "Beware lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him." This was God commanding them to make this an ancient landmark. Do you catch that? I want you to talk about these things. I want you to pass it on to your children and to your grandchildren. You know, when you see people that have a Bible verse on a coffee cup or on their wall, this is where it's supposed to come from, is to be a conversation starter, so that from the time that we rise up in the morning till we go to bed and through the night again, we are pondering on the Lord and what he has done for us and what he has commanded us. Let them take root in our hearts. And then, like I said, the second one is from the book of Leviticus 19, and encourage you to look at that later. But we see this ancient Israelite landmark, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And that Shema is the Hebrew word for hear. But that you shall love, you hear it repeated then, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And others had found that that was an important way of summing up all of the law, is in these two commands. But in regard to our treating others with love, that reminds us that Jesus summed this up a different way in his Sermon on the Mount. So I want you to flip to Matthew chapter 7 for a minute, because this is our third ancient landmark. We've talked about the great Jewish landmark, the Shema. We've talked about this one here, when Jesus sums up all of the commands into these two. And another one is one that I remember being taught, not just as a little kid, but I think I remember being taught this in school, because they were trying to teach us little heathens to treat each other well. And so our elementary teachers taught us this: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, known as the golden rule. And Jesus said that as a part of his Sermon on the Mount, as he was teaching them to just keep asking and praying and to walk through the narrow gate. In between it is squeezed this little thing: therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. As Jesus says, this is the summary of it all. To do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's just kind of a common wisdom. And it's been repeated in different variations in other cultures, even all the way to Confucius, although most of them said it backwards: don't do to people what you wouldn't want them to do to you. But Jesus opens it up and makes it a action. Do to others what you would want them to do to you. And he hopes that we would want done to us, and that we would do to others what God has already commanded us to do. And I want to pause for a second here and finish what Jesus said to the questioner in Mark chapter 12. The questioner there, he says, "You're right, teacher. To do these things, to love God and with all the heart, with all the understanding, to love my neighbor as myself. This is more important than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices I could do. This is the most important thing." And Jesus answered him and said, "You're not far from the kingdom of God. You're on the right track, young man, but you're not there yet. Even if we could keep these, we're not far. What hinders us? We need Jesus, because we don't keep it entirely. Other things creep into the way of putting God first and loving others supremely. Loving God supremely and putting others before myself. And we need Jesus, not only as our example and teacher, but as our substitute, so that those failings are paid for at the cross, and that we can stand in his righteousness, because he laid down his life for his neighbor, loving them supremely. Why? Because that's what the Father asked. And he loved his Father, loved God supremely above all else. And thus, that is the gospel of the kingdom, straight from the King himself. I pray that we have embraced this Jesus. He's got one more thing to tell us before we're done. Oh, we've had some good landmarks from Jesus thus far. God bless, God keep you. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.